There are moments that split your life in two. Before and after. This was mine. The fire had been dying for over an hour, but neither of us moved to feed it more wood. We sat on opposite sides of the stone circle, close enough that I could see the orange light catching the stubble along Wesley's jaw, far enough that the space between us felt like an ocean. The lake stretched out behind him, black water disappearing into black sky, and somewhere in that darkness a loon was calling. Its voice echoed off the water, lonely and wild, the kind of sound that makes you remember you're small. I had rehearsed this moment 100 times, maybe 1,000, in my car during the drive up here, in the shower that morning, while we fished in comfortable silence, while we grilled burgers and talked about everything except what I came here to say. The words had worn smooth in my mouth like stones tumbled by waves, but now that the moment was here, they felt sharp again. Dangerous. Wesley was poking at the coals with a stick, making them glow brighter for a few seconds before they faded back to gray. He looked older than I remembered. Not just the lines around his eyes or the way his shoulders curved forward now, but something deeper. A tiredness that hadn't been there in college, when we would stay up until 3 in the morning talking about books and dreams and the vast future that seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of us. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It never was with Wesley. We had always been good at quiet, even back when we were 20 and thought we had to fill every pause with words. But this quiet felt different. Heavier, like it was waiting for something. I took a breath that tasted like wood smoke and summer air. My heart was beating so hard I was sure he could hear it over the crackling embers. "Wesley," I said, and my voice came out rougher than I intended. He looked up from the fire, and for a second the light caught his eyes, turning them amber. "I need to tell you something." He set down the stick, folded his hands in his lap, waited. The words I had practiced dissolved on my tongue. Instead, what came out was raw and unplanned and true. "I used to be in love with you. I think I still am." The confession hung in the air between us like smoke. I watched his face, searching for disgust or pity or worse, that careful kindness people use when they want to let you down gently. Instead, Wesley laughed. Not the cruel bark of someone shocked or offended, but something softer. Surprised. Almost relieved. The sound made something crack open in my chest. I had expected rejection. I had prepared for it. But not this gentle disbelief. This laugh that seemed to say, of course you are. Why did it take you so long to say it?" Then the laughter faded, and Wesley went very still. He stared into the fire, and I watched the light play across his face, highlighting the strong line of his nose, the curve of his mouth. When he finally looked at me again, his expression had changed. Something vulnerable had surfaced there, something I had never seen before. "What if I felt the same?" he said, so quietly I almost didn't hear him over the settling logs. The world stopped. The loon fell silent. Even the fire seemed to pause its endless consuming, and in that suspension I felt everything I thought I knew about my life rearrange itself. 20 years of careful friendship, of buried feelings, of late nights wondering what if. And now here was the answer, offered so simply it almost didn't seem real. We didn't move toward each other, didn't speak again. We just sat there in the dying light, two men on opposite sides of a fire, separated by 3 feet of space and 20 years of silence. But something had shifted. The air between us hummed with possibility and terror in equal measure. A log collapsed in the fire, sending up a shower of sparks that disappeared into the darkness above our heads. I watched them rise and fade and thought about all the words we hadn't said yet, all the truths still waiting in the quiet spaces between us. The loon called again from somewhere out on the water, and this time it didn't sound lonely at all. That night by the fire seems like a dream now, but let me tell you how I got there. How a man with a mortgage and a wedding ring picked out can find himself confessing love to his best friend under a sky full of stars. My life before that moment was the kind people call blessed. I lived in a beige house on Maple Street with Elise, who had the kindest eyes I'd ever seen and a way of arranging flowers that made our kitchen table look like something from a magazine. She worked at the library downtown, came home smelling like old books and coffee, always had a story about some patron who made her laugh. On paper, we were perfect. high school English teacher and librarian, two people who understood the weight of words, planning a wedding for next spring. I was good at my job. The kids called me Mr. Reeves, asked me for book recommendations, stayed after class to talk about Gatsby and Holden Caulfield. I had patience for their questions, their awkward attempts at poetry, their essays about what they wanted to be when they grew up. Some days I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be, standing in front of a whiteboard, helping 17-year-olds discover that literature could crack their hearts open in all the right ways. But there were other days. Sunday mornings when Elise slept late and I sat on our back porch with coffee, watching the neighbors walk their dogs, feeling like I was observing someone else's life through glass. Late-night drives when I couldn't sleep, taking the long way home from nowhere, letting muscle memory guide me through streets that all looked the same. Those were the moments when the ache surfaced, the feeling that something essential was missing, that I was living at half volume. I met Wesley freshman year of college. He was my roommate's friend, this lanky kid from up north who read Kerouac and played guitar badly and had opinions about everything. We stayed up too late talking about books, about the future, about whether we believed in God or love, or the possibility that we might actually matter in this world. He had this way of listening that made you want to tell him secrets you'd never spoken out loud. We were inseparable for 4 years. Study partners, road trip companions, the kind of friends who could sit in comfortable silence for hours. I was in love with him by sophomore year, maybe earlier, but I buried that truth so deep I almost convinced myself it wasn't real. Wesley dated girls with long hair and easy laughs. I dated them too, tried to mirror his choices, his casual way of moving through the world. After graduation, we promised to stay close. We lasted about 2 years. Wesley married Sarah, a sweet girl from his hometown, had a daughter named Emma who looked just like him. I sent birthday cards, Christmas gifts, called less and less often. It was easier to let the distance grow than to keep pretending that hearing about his happy family didn't feel like swallowing glass. For 10 years, we exchanged polite updates. Holiday cards with photos of his growing daughter. Brief emails about job changes, moves, the ordinary milestones of adult life. I met Elise, started teaching, bought the house on Maple Street. Built a life that looked exactly like what I was supposed to want. Then last spring, Wesley texted me out of nowhere. Sarah had left him. She'd been having an affair, wanted a divorce, was moving to California with Emma for her new job. He was staying at his parents' old lake house for the summer, trying to figure out what came next. I stared at that message for a long time, sitting in my car outside the grocery store while Elise waited inside, probably picking out apples and bread and all the small things that make up a shared life. I felt something shift in my chest, a door I'd kept locked for years creaking open. When I got home, I told Elise about Wesley's divorce. She made sympathetic sounds, asked if I wanted to reach out to him. She'd heard me mention Wesley before, knew we'd been close in college. "You should visit him," she said, spooning pasta onto our matching plates. "You've been working too hard. A weekend at a lake sounds perfect." I agreed, maybe too quickly. Started planning the drive north, telling myself it was just about being a good friend, offering support during a difficult time. But late that night, lying next to Elise while she slept, I knew I was lying to myself. I was going because some part of me had been waiting 10 years for exactly this kind of opening, this chance to see Wesley again without the careful boundaries of his marriage holding everything in place. I packed light, left on a Friday afternoon, drove 3 hours through farmland and forest, past landmarks I'd forgotten I remembered. The gas station where we used to buy energy drinks for all-night study sessions. The overlook where we'd watched thunderstorms roll across the valley, feeling infinite and invincible and young. The lake house looked smaller than I remembered, weathered cedar shingles and a dock that sagged slightly into the water. Wesley was waiting on the porch, older now, broader in the shoulders, but his smile was exactly the same. We fell back into our old rhythm, so easily it scared me. Beer on the dock, swimming at sunset, long conversations that picked up exactly where we'd left off 20 years ago. For 3 days, I almost convinced myself that friendship was enough, that this easy companionship, this feeling of coming home, was all I had really been missing. Then came that night by the fire, when all my careful walls came tumbling down. The text arrived on a Tuesday morning while I was grading essays about symbolism in Romeo and Juliet. My phone buzzed against my desk, and when I saw Wesley's name on the screen, my heart did something I wasn't prepared for. "Hey, stranger. The lake's still here. You should come up. Just like old times." I stared at those words until they blurred. Stranger. We had been strangers, hadn't we? 10 years of Christmas cards and polite distance had made us into people who once knew each other, who carried memories of a friendship that felt more like a dream than something that had actually happened. I started typing responses and deleting them. "Work's crazy right now. Elise and I have wedding stuff. Maybe later this summer." Each excuse felt true and hollow at the same time. I set the phone aside and tried to focus on the essays, but the words swam on the page. My students had written about love and fate and tragedy, and all I could think about was a boy I used to know who read Kerouac under streetlights and believed the world was wide enough for all of us. That evening, I told Elise about the message. We were making dinner together, her chopping vegetables while I stirred pasta sauce, the kind of domestic rhythm we'd perfected over 3 years of living together. She paused with the knife halfway through a carrot. "Wesley," she said, like she was trying to place the name. "Your college friend, right? The one who got divorced." I nodded, not trusting my voice to stay steady. "You should go," she said, returning to her chopping. "You've been working so hard lately. A weekend at a lake sounds perfect." It was that simple for her. Of course it was. In Elise's world, friends helped friends through difficult times. She couldn't know that this particular friend carried 20 years of buried feelings, couldn't sense the way my pulse had quickened just reading his name on my phone screen. I waited 3 days to respond. 3 days of carrying my phone like it weighed 100 pounds, of catching myself staring out classroom windows instead of teaching, of lying awake next to Elise while she slept peacefully beside me. Finally, on Friday morning, I typed back, "I can come up this weekend if that works." The drive north felt like traveling backward through time. I passed the exit for our old college town, the diner where we used to eat pancakes at 2 in the morning, the music store where Wesley bought his first decent guitar. The landscape gradually shifted from suburbs to farmland to forest, and with each mile, I felt some carefully constructed part of myself beginning to unravel. I pulled into the lake house driveway just as the sun was starting to sink toward the treeline. The place looked exactly the same and completely different all at once. Smaller than my memory had made it, the cedar shingles weathered to silver gray, the dock extending into water that reflected the sky like dark glass. Wesley emerged from the house before I'd even turned off the engine, and for a moment we just looked at each other across the distance between my car and his front porch. He was broader now, his hair shorter and touched with gray at the temples, lines around his eyes that spoke of too much sun and too little sleep. But his smile was exactly the same, that crooked grin that had always made me feel like I was the only person in the world worth talking to. We hugged briefly, awkwardly, the way men do when they're not sure of the boundaries anymore. He smelled like wood smoke and lake water and something that was just distinctly Wesley, a scent that threw me back 20 years in an instant. The first night was easy. We grilled burgers on his parents' old charcoal grill, drank beer on the dock while the sun disappeared behind the trees, talked about safe things. His job teaching at a community college upstate, my students, and their endless questions about whether Shakespeare was relevant to their lives. We caught up on mutual friends, people we'd lost touch with, the ordinary architecture of adult conversation. But there were moments when the old intimacy surfaced, when he laughed at something I said, and I remembered how that sound used to make me feel like I was home. When our hands brushed reaching for the same beer bottle, and neither of us pulled away immediately. When the conversation lulled and we sat in comfortable silence, watching bats skim the water's surface in the growing dark. The second day, we fell back into rhythms I'd forgotten we had. We swam in the morning, the water cold enough to steal our breath, then lay on the dock letting the sun dry us while we talked about books, about whether we'd become the people we thought we would, about the strange weight of being almost 40 and still feeling like we were pretending to be adults. That afternoon, We took his parents' old canoe out to the middle of the lake. Wesley had always been the better paddler, and I let him guide us while I trailed my fingers in the water and watched the shoreline drift past. He told me about Emma, how she called him every few days from California, how much he missed her laugh echoing through the house. He talked about Sarah too, but carefully, like someone walking around broken glass. "I should have asked you to be my best man," he said suddenly, his paddle resting across his knees. "When Sarah and I got married. I wanted to, but I don't know what I thought." "You thought it would be weird," I said, "having your college roommate there when you barely kept in touch anymore." He shook his head. "That wasn't it. I think I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" He didn't answer, just started paddling again, steering us back towards shore. That night, we built a fire in the stone circle behind the house, sat across from each other with the flames between us, drinking wine from his parents' old coffee mugs, talking about everything and nothing. The conversation grew deeper as the fire burned lower, the way it always had with us. We talked about regret, about the paths not taken, about the strange ache of middle age when you realize that most of your life is probably behind you now. And then, when the fire had died to glowing coals and the night had settled around us like a blanket, I found myself saying the words I'd carried for 20 years. The confession that would split my life in two, that would make everything that came after different from everything that came before. The moment I'd been driving toward without realizing it. The reason I'd really come to this place where we used to be young together. We didn't speak of it the next morning. I woke to the sound of coffee brewing in the kitchen, the smell of bacon in a cast-iron pan, and found Wesley standing at the stove like nothing had shifted between us in the darkness. He handed me a mug without meeting my eyes, asked if I wanted eggs scrambled or over easy, and for a moment I wondered if I had dreamed the whole thing. But something had changed. It lived in the space between us now, humming like a live wire. When he passed me the salt, our fingers brushed, and neither of us pulled away immediately. When I caught him looking at me across the breakfast table, he didn't pretend he hadn't been. The confession hung there, unspoken but present, changing the weight of every ordinary moment. We spent the morning fixing his parents' old fishing rods, untangling line, and replacing rusty hooks at the workbench in the garage. Wesley worked with his hands the way he always had, methodical and careful, but I found myself watching the way his fingers moved, the concentration on his face, things I'd trained myself not to notice 20 years ago. The lake was glass smooth when we took the boat out around noon. We didn't talk much, just cast our lines and let the boat drift while the sun climbed higher. But when Wesley caught a base and his face lit up with that boyish grin I remembered, something loosened in my chest. This was still us, still the easy companionship that had sustained us through 4 years of college. The confession hadn't broken that. If anything, it had freed something that had always been there, waiting. That afternoon, we rebuilt the canoe rack that had collapsed over the winter. Wesley's father had built the original when we were in college, and I remembered helping him sand the cedar boards that first summer I'd visited. Now Wesley and I worked side by side, measuring and cutting new pieces, our shoulders bumping as we maneuvered the lumber into place. He was telling me about Emma, how she'd inherited his stubborn streak and Sarah's gift for making friends wherever she went. His voice softened when he talked about her, and I could see the ache there, the way missing her lived in his chest like a physical weight. "She wants to visit next month," he said, holding a board steady while I drove screws into the joints. "But Sarah thinks it's too soon. Too confusing. For Emma or for you?" I asked. He paused, considering. "Both, probably." We worked in comfortable silence after that, but I found myself stealing glances at him, noticing things I'd forgotten. The way he bit his lower lip when he was concentrating. The scar on his knuckle from when he'd punched a wall in college after his girlfriend broke up with him. The careful way he lined up each measurement. The same precision he'd always brought to everything that mattered. That evening, we cooked together like we used to. Wesley grilled chicken while I made salad and rice, moving around the small kitchen in a dance we'd perfected years ago. But every accidental touch felt electric now. When he reached around me for a plate, his chest brushed against my back, and I felt my breath catch. When I handed him the pepper, Our palms touched for just a second longer than necessary. After dinner, we sat on the porch with a bottle of wine Wesley had been saving, our feet bare, our knees touching on the old glider that had been there since his childhood. The night was warm and thick with the sound of crickets, and I felt more relaxed than I had in months, maybe years. Wesley started talking about his marriage then, really talking, in a way he never had before. He told me about the slow drift that had started almost immediately, how he'd felt like he was playing a part in someone else's life, how he'd loved Sarah, but not in the way she deserved, how sometimes he'd catch himself dreaming about being touched by someone who really saw him, who knew all his secrets and wanted him anyway. The words hung between us, loaded with meaning I didn't dare acknowledge out loud. But I understood. God, I understood so completely it hurt. I have something I want to show you, I said, and went inside to dig through my overnight bag. I brought it without really knowing why, an old journal from our senior year of college, filled with poems and fragments of stories we'd written together. I found the page I was looking for and returned to the porch. Remember this? I asked, and began to read aloud the poem we'd written during finals week, trading lines back and forth at 3 a.m. while we survived on coffee and determination. My voice was steady, but my heart was racing. The poem was about longing, about the space between wanting and having, and reading it now felt like a confession within a confession. Wesley closed his eyes as I read, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long time. I wrote that for you, he said finally. The last stanza. I know we were taking turns, but that ending was all for you. I looked down at the page, at the words I'd memorized without meaning to. In the space between silence and speaking, between fear and flight, I find you waiting, patient as summer rain. We didn't talk about what it meant. We just sat there as the wine warmed us and the night deepened around us, two men on a porch, finally honest about something we'd been carrying for 20 years. Later, much later, I woke to an empty house. My watch said it was almost 3 a.m, and Wesley's bed across the hall was undisturbed. I found him on the dock, sitting at the very end with his legs dangling in the water, looking out at the lake like it might hold answers to questions he couldn't bring himself to ask. I didn't announce myself, just walked out and sat beside him. The dock swayed slightly under our combined weight, and the water lapped softly against the post below us. Wesley didn't seem surprised to find me there. Maybe he'd been waiting. We sat in silence as the sky began to lighten at the edges, watching the mist rise off the water, listening to the loons call from somewhere far across the lake. I thought about all the mornings I'd spent in my beige house on Maple Street, drinking coffee alone while Elise slept, feeling like something essential was missing from my life. This was what had been missing. This quiet communion, this feeling of being completely known. Just as the sun broke the horizon, Wesley shifted beside me. His hand moved across the weathered wood of the dock, covering mine but not quite holding it. Just resting there, warm and solid and real. A question and an answer and a promise all at once. We stayed like that until the sun was fully up, until we could hear cars starting in the distance and the ordinary world calling us back. But something had been settled between us in that silence, some permission granted that neither of us was quite ready to name. When we finally stood to go back inside, Wesley's hand slipped away from mine, but the warmth lingered, as did the certainty that we had crossed a line we couldn't uncross, entered territory that would require a courage neither of us was sure we possessed. The storm rolled in on our last night like something out of a movie, all dark clouds and distant thunder that made the air feel electric. We'd spent the day in careful normalcy, swimming and reading on the dock, but underneath it all was the memory of his hand on mine, the way the sunrise had found us sitting closer than friends should sit. By evening, the wind was picking up, sending ripples across the lake that caught the last light. Wesley suggested we move inside, and I followed him into the living room where his parents had left everything exactly as it had been 20 years ago. The same plaid couch, the same bookshelf filled with paperback mysteries and nature guides, the same stone fireplace that had warmed us through so many college visits. The power went out just as the first real rain hit the windows. One moment we were sitting with the lamps on, pretending to read separate books, and the next we were in darkness except for the lightning that flickered through the storm clouds. Wesley disappeared into the kitchen and came back with candles, the emergency kind his parents kept for occasions like this. He lit them one by one, placing them around the room until we were surrounded by warm, dancing light that made everything feel smaller and more intimate than it had any right to. I had picked up the poetry journal again, was reading through the pieces we'd written senior year, when Wesley's voice cut through the sound of rain on the roof. "Do you ever wonder how it would have been?" he asked. I looked up from the page. How it would have been. If we'd known then. If we'd been brave enough to say it. The candle flames wavered, throwing shadows across his face. He was sitting on the edge of the couch, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, and there was something in his expression I'd never seen before. A kind of desperate honesty that made my chest tight. I couldn't answer. The words stuck in my throat like stones. Because yes, I had wondered. I'd wondered it 1,000 times over 20 years. Wondered what would have happened if I'd kissed him that night we stayed up until dawn talking about Kerouac. Wondered what would have changed if I'd been honest about the way my heart raced when he laughed at my jokes. Wondered what kind of life we might have built together if we'd been different people, braver people, people who didn't spend decades burying the truth. Wesley stood up then, moved closer to where I sat with the journal in my lap. Not fast, not presumptuous, but with a careful intention that made my pulse skip. He sat beside me on the couch, close enough that I could smell the lake water still in his hair, close enough that when he reached out to touch the page I was reading, his shoulder pressed against mine. "This one," he said, pointing to a poem about longing written in his handwriting. "I was thinking about you when I wrote this. About how much I wanted to tell you something I couldn't name." The storm was getting stronger outside, wind howling around the corners of the house, but inside this circle of candlelight it felt like we were the only two people left in the world. Wesley turned to look at me, and I saw 20 years of careful friendship stripped away, leaving something raw and true and terrifying. He moved closer, not quickly, not with certainty, but like someone testing the temperature of water before diving in. His hand came up to touch my face, and I felt my breath catch. This was the moment I realized. The place where everything we'd been dancing around for days, for years, for decades, finally came to rest. When he kissed me, it was soft and hesitant and perfect. A question wrapped in 20 years of fear and longing. His lips were warm and tasted like the wine we'd shared at dinner. And for a moment, I let myself sink into it, let myself feel what I dreamed about, but never allowed myself to truly want. Then reality crashed over me like cold water. I pulled back, breathless and shaking, the journal falling to the floor between us. "I'm marrying Elise," I said, and the words felt like armor, like a shield I was desperately trying to hold between us and this moment that would change everything. Wesley nodded, his hand falling away from my face. "I know," he said simply. The acceptance in his voice somehow made it worse. We sat there in the flickering candlelight, the storm raging outside, and I felt something break inside my chest. Not my heart, exactly, but the careful construction I'd built my adult life around. The story I'd told myself about who I was and what I wanted and what was possible. "I should go," I said, standing up too quickly, my legs unsteady beneath me. Wesley didn't try to stop me. He just watched as I gathered my things, blew out the candles one by one, as if extinguishing the light could somehow undo what had just happened between us. I left early the next morning while he was still sleeping, loading my car as quietly as possible and driving away without looking back. I told myself it was easier this way, cleaner, that we could pretend the kiss had never happened, that we could go back to being the strangers we'd made ourselves into over the past 10 years. But as I drove south through the storm-washed morning, I knew I was lying to myself. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. Some truths, once spoken with touch instead of words, change everything that comes after. The taste of him lingered on my lips for the entire 3-hour drive home. Home felt wrong from the moment I walked through the door. The beige walls, the carefully arranged furniture, the wedding dress hanging in our bedroom closet like a ghost of the future I'd promised someone else. Everything looked exactly the same, but I felt like a stranger in my own life. Elise was in the kitchen when I arrived, arranging flowers she'd picked from our garden. She looked up when I dropped my keys on the counter, and her smile faltered when she saw my face. "How was your weekend?" she asked, and I heard the careful note in her voice, the way people talk when they're trying not to spook something wild. "Fine," I said. "Good. It was good to see Wesley again." But it wasn't fine, and we both knew it. I couldn't look at her directly, couldn't meet those kind eyes that had never asked for anything from me except honesty. I unpacked my bag mechanically, putting dirty clothes in the hamper, toiletries back in their proper places, trying to rebuild the ordinary rhythms of my life. The voicemail arrived that evening while I was grading papers, and Elise was reading in the living room. My phone buzzed, and when I saw Wesley's name, my hand shook so badly I almost dropped it. I listened to his message in the bathroom with the door locked. The volume turned so low I had to strain to hear his voice. "I shouldn't have kissed you," he said, and there was something broken in the way he spoke. "But I'm not sorry. I can't be. I've been thinking about it for 20 years, and I'm not sorry it finally happened. I know you have a life, Damien. I know you're getting married. But I had to tell you. I had to say it out loud at least once." I played it again, and again, until I had memorized every pause, every inflection, every breath between words. Then I deleted it and sat on the bathroom floor, wondering how something that felt so right could destroy everything I'd spent 5 years building. The next few days blurred together. I went through the motions of my life like an actor who'd forgotten his lines. I taught my classes, graded essays, attended a wedding venue tasting with Elise where everything tasted like cardboard. I smiled when I was supposed to smile, nodded when I was supposed to nod, but inside I felt like I was coming apart at the seams. Elise noticed. Of course she noticed. She'd always been observant, always attuned to the small changes in my mood. But she didn't push, just watched me with those careful eyes and waited for me to tell her what was wrong. I started taking long walks after dinner, telling her I needed exercise, needed air. Really, I needed to get away from the weight of her concern, from the wedding planning magazines on our coffee table, from the life we'd built that suddenly felt like someone else's dream. I walked our neighborhood for hours, past houses where families were settling in for the evening, where couples were sharing dinner and planning weekends and believing in their futures together. I wrote Elise a letter I never sent, sitting at my desk at 3 in the morning while she slept peacefully in our bed. I wrote about Wesley, about the feelings I'd buried for 20 years, about the kiss that had awakened something I'd convinced myself was dead. I wrote about the part of me she'd never known, the secret I'd carried through our entire relationship. Then I tore it up and threw it away, scattered the pieces like confetti of a truth I wasn't brave enough to speak. But secrets have a weight of their own, and this one was pressing against my ribs like something trying to break free. 3 weeks after I'd returned from the lake, I found myself sitting across from Elise at our kitchen table, the words finally forcing their way out of my chest. "I need to tell you something," I said, and watched her set down her coffee cup with the careful precision of someone bracing for impact. I told her about Wesley, not about the kiss, not about the specific moments that would hurt her needlessly, but about the feelings. About the part of me that had never been fully present in our relationship, that had been quietly devoted to someone else for 20 years. About the ache I'd carried that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with who I was, who I'd always been. Elise listened without interrupting. She didn't cry, didn't get angry, didn't throw anything or storm out of the room. She just sat there, absorbing the truth I was finally speaking, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long time. "Did you ever really want to marry me?" she asked finally, and her voice was so soft I almost didn't hear her. The question hung between us like smoke. I wanted to lie, to tell her yes, to protect her from the full weight of what I was admitting. But she deserved better than that. She deserved the truth, even if it destroyed us both. "I thought I did," I said. "I wanted to want it. You're everything anyone could ask for, Elise. You're kind and smart and beautiful, and you deserve someone who loves you completely. But I don't think I know how to do that. I don't think I ever have." She nodded, like this confirmed something she'd suspected but had never allowed herself to name. There was no anger in her face, no recrimination. just a profound sadness that made my chest ache. We sat there in our kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of the life we'd planned together, and I felt something essential shift between us. Not love, exactly, but the illusion of a shared future. The story we'd been telling ourselves about who we were and what we wanted. That night, after we'd talked until we had no more words left, after we'd held each other like people saying goodbye, I called Wesley. The phone rang and rang, but no one answered. Just his voicemail, that familiar voice asking me to leave a message. I hung up without speaking, not sure what I would say anyway. The truth was out now, floating between Elise and me like something we couldn't unsee. But the future was still a blank page, and I had no idea what to write there. I returned to the lake house in late September, when the leaves had turned and the air carried the promise of winter. Everything had changed. Elise and I had called off the wedding with a gentleness that somehow made it hurt more. She'd moved back to her apartment downtown, taken the library job in Portland she'd been considering. We'd divided our shared life with the careful politeness of people who had loved each other, just not in the right way. My resignation letter was already submitted. I'd finish the school year, then figure out what came next. For the first time in 20 years, my future was completely unwritten. The lake house looked different in autumn. Smaller somehow, nestled among trees that had shed half their leaves onto the water. I parked in the same spot I had months ago, but this time I wasn't nervous. I was just tired, bone-deep tired, and ready to stop running from who I was. The house was empty. I'd expected that, somehow. Wesley's car was gone, and when I tried the door, it was locked. But I remembered where his parents had always hidden the spare key, under the loose board on the porch steps, and it was still there after all these years. Inside, everything was exactly as we'd left it. The same plaid couch, the same bookshelf, even the wine glasses we'd used that last night still sitting clean in the dish drainer. But there was something different in the air, something expectant. I walked to the dock automatically, my feet finding the familiar path through the trees. The boards were slick with morning dew, and fog hung low over the water, making the far shore disappear into gray nothingness. It felt like standing at the edge of the world. That's when I found the note, tucked under a smooth stone at the end of the dock. Wesley's handwriting, careful and familiar. Thought you might come back. Coffee's inside. I'll be home soon. I read it 3 times before the words sank in. He'd known. Somehow, he'd known I would come. The coffee was in the kitchen, a thermos still warm, as if he'd just left. I poured myself a cup and returned to the dock, settling cross-legged at the very end with the mug warming my hands. The fog was starting to lift, revealing glimpses of the far shore, and I watched it shift and change like something alive. Hours passed. I didn't know if Wesley was really coming back, or if this was just his way of saying goodbye. But I waited anyway, because this was where I belonged. Not in the beige house on Maple Street, not in front of a classroom full of teenagers, but here, in this quiet place where I'd finally learned to tell the truth. The sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the fog. Leaves drifted down from the trees around the house, landing on the water like small boats headed nowhere. I thought about Elise, probably unpacking boxes in her new apartment, building a life that didn't include me. I hoped she would find someone who could love her the way she deserved. I thought about my students, who would get a new teacher next year, someone who might teach them better than I ever could about what it meant to be brave. Mostly, I thought about time. How much of it I'd wasted pretending to be someone I wasn't. How many years I'd spent building a life that looked right from the outside, but felt empty at the center. How different things might have been if I'd been honest 20 years ago, or 10, or even 5. But maybe this was how it was supposed to happen. Maybe we both needed to lose ourselves completely before we could find our way back to each other. Maybe some truths can only be spoken when you have nothing left to lose. The sun was directly overhead when I heard a car in the driveway. I didn't turn around, just kept looking out at the water, steam rising from my cup, the wind moving through my hair. I was finally still, finally honest, finally home. Footsteps on the dock behind me. The boards creaking under familiar weight. Wesley settling beside me without a word, close enough that our shoulders touched. We sat like that for a long time, 2 men at the end of a dock, watching the water catch the light. Eventually, he would tell me about the months he'd spent thinking, about his decision to move back permanently, about the job teaching at the local community college. Eventually, I would tell him about Elise, about leaving my life behind, about the terrifying freedom of starting over at 40. But for now, we just sat in the silence, and it was enough. More than enough. It was everything.